Do you really think Pokemon was only limited to the Game Boy? What if Pokemon was available on the Game Gear back in the 90s? How would that change the Pokemon world? How would that change the real world? And how would that change the franchise? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that question was asked today. And it was asked as if Pocket Monsters, the original Pokemon, the red, green, blue versions, possibly as well as the yellow version that came out after, were on the Game Gear instead of the Nintendo Game Boy. What would happen if it released April 22nd, 1992 worldwide under the guise of SEGA? So, we're going to be exploring that today and talking about that, except there's just one problem. It already did come out. That there is a game on the SEGA Game Gear called Pokemon Legends, and prepare yourselves, ladies and gentlemen. This is what Pokemon on the SEGA Game Gear would look like. Pokemon Legends. And so there's an English patch for this game if you would really like to get it. I wouldn't get it because I'll explain later why I wouldn't patch out this game and just play it in general. So the game starts off with a crawl of a language that I can't understand because I'm not Japanese, so can't read that. And shout outs to anyone who can. If it's Korean or Chinese, still can't read it. The game starts you out on a ship. This is your typical Pokemon experience, right? Yeah. And then you just literally walk out of a castle. It looks like somebody just put Red and Pikachu in the Game Gear. Like, once again, this is like Pokemon Yellow because Pikachu's following Red. So the game, it progresses very similarly in nature to a standard RPG. Not really sure why they chose to do what they did, but for whatever reason, Red gets rid of Pikachu, and Pikachu gets kicked to the curb and is on its own. So you leave town and you encounter enemies. This is typical Final Fantasy-esque RPG notions. There's nothing particularly special about it. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. It's turn-based RPG mechanics, and it's on SEGA Game Gear. And you are very clearly Pikachu having battles with what appears to be a Rattatas, or maybe they're Raticates? I don't know. Once again, I can't really read the language. There's no way to determine what's going on. There's no way to determine what's happening because of the language barrier. And normally in platforming games, this wouldn't really be a problem because you don't have to read text and language. But in RPGs, you really need to know what you're doing and what's going on. And here, you clearly can't, causing a massive problem. When you beat the enemies, you get some money, you get some experience, and then you encounter more enemies. So this is the point in the game where I was out of HP and I died. And there you have it, the end. But you might be saying to yourself, gee, Proto, that didn't really seem like a Pokemon game to me, because it isn't. It's actually a ROM hack of Eternal Legend. Yeah. So go ahead, have a look-see here. I'm going to compare the opening crawl to Eternal Legend's opening crawl. Some of the intro sequence where you go through the town, where you go outside town and battle the same exact enemies. It is literally just a ROM hack of Eternal Legend. What was Eternal Legend? Well, let me tell you, Eternal Legend was an exclusive, Japan-only Game Gear role-playing game. It's nothing special. It's a traditional game where a boy must save the world from evil monsters and villains and roam outside villages and dungeons. There are 15 caves, 15 villages, and 15 dungeons. It seems like a pretty decent RPG, but again, it's nothing special. And everyone's not playing Eternal Legend 15, everyone's playing Final Fantasy 15. So this game didn't really take off under the SEGA Game Gear brand and go international. There you go. Do you get why they used Eternal Legend because it sounds the same, like Legend, Pokemon Legends. Pokemon has legendaries in it. I don't know. I have no idea. The mind of a bootlegger, the mind of someone who steals other people's content and tries to pass it off as an entirely brand spanking new video game. Insane. But it did happen. So that would be something of how Pokemon might look on the Game Gear. That's the best example I can show you, because there's really no example of Pokemon on Game Gear, because this is a what if. If you guys recall, originally Pokemon wasn't accepted by Nintendo for quite some time. There were multiple pitches that had to be done in order for them to say yes to it. What if in the mid-1980s Sega had accepted Satoshi's pitch for the idea of capsule monsters and early Pokemon concept? If you didn't know, Pokemon was originally called Capsule Monsters, and it was not called Pokemon. No, man, I need to get me a better looking Pokemon Yellow. Nonetheless, we have ourselves a predicament, a conundrum. What would this game look like? How would it be? Would it even exist today? Well, let me explain a few things. Without going into a Why It Matters episode, because I really do want to cover Sega, the Game Gear, and other things that happen with Sega, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of just exactly what would happen. See, Nintendo have really great IPs for the Game Boy. Not just Pokemon, but Pokemon really drove the sales. Here's the thing though. A lot of people forget that Tetris was the one that drove the original giant brick gray Game Boy sales and gave Nintendo its installed market base. Then there was Super Mario Land. There was also The Legend of Zelda, and then there was Metroid as well. So Nintendo had a pretty good foothold in the Game Boy division. Yes, Pokemon did help the Game Boy sales and help it continue, but that wasn't until 1998. You know, again, I guess you could count it in 1996, but Sega wasn't really that popular in Japan with the Game Gear at the time. It's not like if you put Pokemon on the Game Gear that Game Gear would completely decimate and destroy Nintendo and do the same exact thing. In fact, it actually might have failed. So let me explain. Here's the thing about the Game Gear. The Game Gear was about 10 times better than the original fat gray Game Boy. And at the time, they had the Game Boy Pocket, but still, it was much better. It wasn't until the Game Boy Color where the Game Boy even got color. And the Game Gear itself was released around 1990s, 1991, and it was discontinued in 1997. So it only had a good 5 years. And of those 5 years, the first year was used to gather and garner an install base, and the last year was where it was dying off. So really, it only had a good 3 years, unfortunately. Which means, yeah, I don't really think it would have blown up. I don't really think it would have taken Sega to success. If anything, it would have allowed Sega to focus on their mobile division and allow the Game Gear to grow into the viable product that Sega would have today. And Nintendo would have exited the portability market, meaning that the Nintendo Switch would have been more of a stay-at-home console than what it is today. And it might have changed everything. There's no questioning that. But as it stands, I really doubt that due to a few factors. At the time, that we're talking about like the late 90s, 1997 is when it was officially discontinued, the Sega Game Gear. They had several systems on the market. We had the Sega CD, along with the Sega Genesis, which was required for the CD, and then you had the 32X, again requiring the Genesis. We had 3 different versions of the Genesis by the time Genesis was discontinued. The Sega Saturn, we had the Dreamcast on the horizon being developed, and then you had the Sega Game Gear. But then you also had, this is the problem, this is what really killed it, the Sega Nomad. So you have all these Sega products, and it sounds great, man, wonderful. Gamers probably loved it. But at the end of the day, it was a lot of money, and many of them took their own cartridges. Like, for example, the 32X had its own separate set of games. The Sega CD had its own separate set of games. The Game Gear had its own separate set of games. Imagine having a PlayStation in the palm of your hands, and then a downgraded version of that PlayStation also in the palm of your hands. Which one would you buy? Seriously, why would you release the Sega Genesis in the form of the Sega Nomad alongside the Game Gear. What was the point? To have a gaming system that's a little bit cheaper, but less viable, less powerful? You had a portable Sega Genesis. So, yeah, if Pokemon was released on the Game Gear, it likely would have overshadowed the Nomad and destroyed the Nomad, and the Nomad would have been a thing of the past, and the Game Gear would have gotten sequential revisions and led Sega to glory. But more than likely, it would have just led Sega into making handhelds. Because, again, the Dreamcast was destroyed by Sony with the PlayStation 2, not Nintendo, and not Nintendo with Pokemon. But Nintendo was a contributing factor because they were a piece of that pie, along with the Xbox. So, at the end of the day, if Pokemon was released for the Sega Game Gear early on, would it have changed anything? No, not really. Because it would have either made Sega a portable console developer, or it would have just went the same way it went as it did. And Sega would have went bankrupt, and Pokemon likely would have found its way over on the Nintendo side of things anyways, due to its portability and its nature in the portable world. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That's a what-if scenario if Pokemon had originally started on the Sega Game Gear instead of the Nintendo Game Boy, and how that would have affected the market.
I've been PokeStuff, and thanks for watching.